On the night of their 10th wedding anniversary, Zariah Whitmore wore the black dress her husband once said he loved more than any other thing she owned. She had lit candles along the dining table herself, arranged white orchids in a low glass vase, and set out the wine Everett had chosen for their wedding toast a decade earlier. She remembered that night vividly, the way he had held her hands under a string of golden lights and promised her that he wanted to grow old beside her, that no one else would ever come close to what they had built together. 10 years later, she stood in the same kitchen, stirring a sauce she had made 100 times, believing that tonight might finally be the night they found their way back to each other. She did not yet know that her husband had already decided this would be the last dinner they would ever share as a married couple. Everett arrived home 20 minutes late, his tie loosened, his eyes fixed on his phone the entire time he walked through the door. He barely looked at her when he sat down, barely noticed the candles or the wine or the effort folded into every corner of the room. Throughout the meal, his phone buzzed against the table, and each time it did, his jaw tightened in a way Zariah had learned to recognize over the last 6 months. She caught a glimpse of a message lighting up the screen before he flipped it face down, 4 words that would sit in her memory for the rest of her life. "Have you told her yet?" She said nothing in that moment, only lifted her glass and took a slow sip, watching him the way a woman watches a storm she has already prepared for. The candles burned lower as the evening dragged on, wax pooling at their bases, while the two of them sat in a silence that no longer resembled the comfortable quiet of two people who had spent a decade together. Zariah noticed the way Everett's eyes kept flicking toward the hallway, toward the front door, toward anything that was not her face across the table. She had imagined this anniversary many times in the weeks leading up to it, rehearsing conversations she hoped she would never actually need to have, preparing for outcomes she had prayed would remain hypothetical. Now, watching her husband refuse to meet her eyes over a meal she had spent hours preparing, she understood that the version of tonight she had hoped for was never going to arrive. The silence between them thickened until it became its own presence at the table, heavier than the food, heavier than the wine. Zariah finally asked him what was wrong, her voice calm, controlled, giving him every opportunity to be honest with her. Everett set his glass down with more force than necessary, and looked at her with an expression she had never seen from him before, something cold and final. "Tomorrow," he said, "you're gone from this house." The words landed in the room like a verdict, rather than a request, spoken by a man who believed he still held every ounce of power over the woman across from him. Zariah did not cry. She did not raise her voice, did not push back her chair, did not do any of the things a woman is expected to do in a moment engineered to break her. She simply asked him if that was truly what he wanted, and he told her without hesitation that he was tired of this marriage, that she needed to know her place. There was a contempt in his voice she had heard building for months, a tone that suggested he no longer saw her as an equal, only as an obstacle standing between himself and something he wanted more. She asked him plainly if there was another woman involved, and Everett said nothing at all. His silence answered the question more completely than any words could have. She rose from the table without another word and walked toward the small office at the end of the hallway, her heels quiet against the hardwood floor. Inside a locked drawer sat a cream-colored envelope she had prepared weeks earlier, sealed and waiting for a moment she had hoped would never come. She carried it back to the dining room and placed it in front of him, beside the plate he had barely touched, and told him that if he wanted her gone by morning, he should read what was inside first. Everett looked at the envelope, the way a man looks at something beneath him, already certain it contained nothing more than the beginning of a divorce he assumed she would fight and lose. He tore it open with a smirk still forming at the corner of his mouth, a smirk that vanished the instant his eyes reached the first line. What Everett did not know, and what he could not have imagined in that candlelit room, was that Zariah had already known about his affair for 6 months. She had not stumbled upon a careless text message or a lipstick stain on a collar the way it happens in stories people tell to make betrayal sound simple. She had noticed the pattern the way she noticed everything, quietly, methodically, the way she had built every spreadsheet and every strategy that had ever mattered in their life together. He began coming home later than his schedule explained, citing business trips that never appeared on the company calendar she still had partial access to from her early years, helping run his firm. A hotel charge repeated itself across 3 consecutive months. Always on nights he claimed to be working late at the office instead. Then came the ring, a piece of jewelry that appeared on a credit card statement she had reviewed by habit, a ring that never once appeared on her own hand. A restaurant near the waterfront showed up again and again in the transactions, a place Everett had never once taken her to in 10 years of marriage. Zariah did not confront him in that first week, or even in that first month, because she understood something about her husband that he had forgotten she knew. He only respected certainty, and certainty required evidence. She spent evenings after he fell asleep, going through old files, cross-referencing dates, quietly building a picture of a man who thought his wife was too devoted, or too proud, or too afraid to ever look closely enough to see the truth. It had taken weeks of careful, unhurried work to arrive at a single name. Weeks in which Zariah continued to smile at dinner parties, continued to sign anniversary cards, continued to sleep beside a man she was quietly learning to see clearly for the first time in years. She never once let her voice waver during that period, never once allowed a slammed cabinet or a raised eyebrow to betray what she already suspected. Instead, she watched, catalogued, and waited, the same patient diligence that had once made her indispensable to Everett's company now turned toward dismantling the illusion he had built around their marriage. The name that eventually surfaced was Celeste Vaughn, a woman 5 years younger than Zariah, sharp-featured and ambitious, someone Everett had met through an investment conference 18 months earlier. What wounded Zariah most was not the affair itself, though that alone would have been enough to end most marriages on the spot. It was a comment Everett had made to Celeste, one Zariah found buried in a message thread she was never meant to see, where he told his mistress that his wife brought nothing to their marriage worth keeping. 10 years of building a life together, reduced by her own husband to a sentence meant to justify throwing her away. She read that line only once, memorized every word of it, and then closed the laptop without letting herself cry. Instead of confronting him, Zariah turned her attention to the finances, because she understood something about money that Everett had never fully grasped about loyalty. Money leaves a trail, even when people do not. What she found confirmed a truth she had carried quietly for years but had never spoken aloud, not even to herself in the mirror. The investment firm Everett proudly called his own creation, the company that had made him a name in certain circles of the city, had been built in its earliest days with capital that came directly from her family's inheritance. She had never asked for public credit, had never needed her name on the letterhead, because at the time she believed they were building something together, not something that belonged to him alone. Digging further, she discovered that Everett had begun quietly restructuring certain assets over the previous few months, moving ownership stakes into new corporate entities with unfamiliar names. The timing was not a coincidence, and Zariah was not a woman who believed in coincidences when it came to money. He was preparing for a fast, clean divorce, one that would allow him to keep control of the assets while marrying Celeste before the year was out, all while leaving Zariah with as little as the law would allow him to get away with. Everett believed his wife understood nothing about the architecture of their wealth, believed she had spent the last decade simply enjoying the comfort his success provided. He never once imagined that the woman he was preparing to discard already knew almost everything he thought was hidden. Back at the table, Everett stared at the papers spilling from the envelope, his hands no longer steady the way they had been minutes earlier. "How long?" he asked her, his voice quieter now, stripped of the arrogance it carried only moments before. "Long enough to know exactly how many times you've lied to me," Zariah answered, her tone even, unhurried. A woman who had rehearsed this moment in her mind more times than she could count. She watched something shift behind his eyes. The first flicker of a man realizing the ground beneath him was not as solid as he believed. Across the city, in an apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the water, Celeste Vaughn was already imagining the life she believed was about to begin. Everett had promised her, in the quiet hours after their meetings, that the marriage was ending, that the house would eventually be theirs, that a portion of the company would be restructured in his name alone once the divorce was finalized. He had told her that Zariah would be pushed out entirely, left with nothing but a modest settlement and a wounded pride she would eventually learn to live with. Celeste had allowed herself to believe every word of it, partly because she wanted to, and partly because she had convinced herself that a woman like Zariah, composed and quiet, would never have the nerve to fight for what was hers. She pictured Zariah as the kind of wife who would cry, who would beg, who would cling to a marriage long after her husband had made his choice clear. It never occurred to Celeste that the woman she dismissed so easily had spent months collecting the very evidence that could unravel everything Everett had promised her. While Celeste selected paint colors for a house that was never legally hers to imagine, Zariah was sitting across a conference table from Marlowe Bennett, a financial attorney with a reputation for being quiet, precise, and impossible to rattle. Marlowe had reviewed the documents Zariah brought her, with the calm of someone who had seen 100 marriages collapse under the weight of hidden money and broken promises. She told Zariah that emotion had no place in a fight like this one, that the only questions that mattered were the ones written in ink. Who owned what? Who had contributed which funds? Whose signature appeared on which document? And who had moved which asset and when? Zariah listened carefully, taking in every word, because she had already decided that this would not become a public spectacle fueled by anger and humiliation. She wanted something colder and more precise than revenge born from hurt feelings. Marlowe slid a folder across the table containing records Everett believed no one would ever trace back to him. Transfers into accounts connected to Celeste, assets quietly reorganized in the weeks before he told his wife to leave. "I don't want to destroy him," Zariah said quietly, staring at the papers without touching them. Marlowe studied her for a long moment before asking if she was certain that was the right approach. "I'm not interested in destroying him," Zariah repeated, choosing her words with the same precision she used in every part of her life. "I want him to see exactly what he destroyed with his own hands." Buried within the paperwork was something even Marlowe found remarkable, a clause in the original financial agreement Everett had signed years earlier, one he had almost certainly forgotten existed. It was a clause that bound certain assets to conditions he was now on the verge of violating, conditions that, if triggered, would give Zariah far more leverage than Everett could possibly anticipate. Marlowe circled the clause twice before looking up at her client with something close to admiration. "This changes everything," she said quietly, and Zariah simply nodded, because she had already suspected as much for weeks. Back at the dinner table, Everett flipped through the remaining pages inside the envelope, his composure slipping further with every document he uncovered. There were copies of financial transfers he assumed had been buried in layers of corporate paperwork, timestamps that lined up perfectly with dates he thought no one would ever cross-reference. There were photographs, discreet and unremarkable on their own, showing him and Celeste together at the restaurant that had appeared so many times on his credit statements. There was a copy of the property agreement tied to the house they were currently sitting in, and beneath that, the original marital financial agreement both of them had signed the week before their wedding. At the very bottom sat a formal letter from Marlowe's office, addressed not to Everett, but prepared for a future he had not yet imagined for himself. "Where did you get all of this?" Everett demanded, his voice rising in a way that startled even him, a sound too loud for a room that had been so quiet only minutes before. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" Zariah asked, not as a challenge, but as a simple, unavoidable truth laid bare between them. Everett tried to regain control of the conversation, accusing her of invading his privacy, of digging through things that were not hers to see. Zariah reminded him, calmly, that everything in that envelope came from financial records that were, by law and by marriage, just as much hers as his. When accusations failed to shake her, Everett shifted toward threats, his voice dropping into something meant to sound dangerous rather than desperate. "If you make this bigger than it needs to be," he warned her, "you will end up with nothing at all." Zariah looked at him for a long moment before answering, her voice steady, almost gentle in its devastation. "That's exactly what you always assumed about me," she said, and for the first time that night, Everett had no response ready. She told him she had known for weeks that he intended to alter the ownership structure of certain assets before finalizing any divorce, a plan designed specifically to leave her with as little claim as possible. What he failed to understand, she explained, was that the very agreement he signed a decade earlier still gave her rights to portions of what he was trying so carefully to hide. Everett stared at her as though seeing her for the first time in years, finally recognizing that the woman across the table was no longer the version of Zariah he had grown used to underestimating. She was not arguing with him. She was not pleading with him. She was negotiating from a position of power he had never once considered she might hold. One final document remained inside the envelope, and Zariah slid it toward him with the same calm she had carried through the entire evening. "This is why I told you to read it all the way to the end," she said, watching his eyes drop to the page. Everett unfolded the paper slowly, aware now that whatever it contained would likely be the most important thing he read all night. To understand how they had arrived at this moment, one had to look back 10 years, long before the affair, long before the resentment, long before the contempt that had settled so deeply into their marriage. Everett's company had been on the brink of collapse in its earliest days, buried under debt, abandoned by investors who saw no future in a young man with more ambition than capital. It was Zariah who had helped pull him back from the edge, not simply with encouragement, but with the tangible, calculated work of someone who understood finance far better than he ever gave her credit for. She built the early financial systems that kept the company functioning, tracked down investors willing to take a chance when no one else would, and negotiated contracts that Everett later claimed, in rooms full of colleagues, to have secured entirely on his own. There was a moment, one she remembered with painful clarity, when she used a portion of her own inherited assets to personally guarantee a loan that saved the company from folding within its first 18 months. Everett had promised her then, in a voice thick with gratitude and fear, that if he ever succeeded, she would always stand beside him, recognized as the partner who helped build everything from nothing. For a while, he kept that promise in private, thanking her quietly, relying on her judgment before every major decision the company faced. But as the company grew, so did his need to be seen as the sole architect of its success. And slowly, without ever announcing it outright, he began erasing her from the story. In meetings, he introduced her only as his wife, never as a partner, never as someone who had once rescued the very foundation he now stood on so proudly. Colleagues who had known the early years began to forget, or perhaps chose to forget, the woman who had once sat beside Everett at 3 a.m, restructuring debt schedules and calling investors across time zones. Zariah noticed the erasure happening in small increments, a missed mention here, an omitted detail there, until one day she realized her own history had been rewritten by the very man she helped save. It was not simply infidelity that had betrayed her. It was the slow, deliberate unmaking of her place in the story of their shared life. Throughout all of it, she had kept records, not out of suspicion at first, but out of habit, the same habit that had made her indispensable to the company in its earliest days. Now, sitting across from him at their anniversary table, she finally laid out her terms with the clarity of someone who had waited years to say them aloud. He was welcome to end the marriage, she told him, welcome to walk away and build a new life with whomever he chose. But he could not have the affair, the stolen credit, and the assets all at once, not while pretending she was the one with nothing to offer. Everett's anger surged past the point of composure, and he slammed his hand against the table hard enough to rattle the glasses. "You think you're winning," he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of a control he no longer had. Zariah rose slowly from her chair, unhurried, unwilling to match his volume with her own. "No," she said quietly, looking directly into his eyes. "You lost a long time ago. You just didn't know it yet." Before Everett could respond, his phone rang, the screen lighting up with the name of the company's lead attorney, a call that never came this late unless something serious had surfaced. He answered with visible reluctance, and within seconds his expression shifted from irritation to something closer to alarm. The attorney explained that certain asset transfers had triggered an internal review, flagged by compliance procedures Everett had assumed were mere formalities. Details were still emerging, the attorney warned, but there was a real possibility that the restructuring Everett had quietly arranged violated terms he himself had agreed to years earlier. Panic crept into Everett's voice as he tried to gather more information, but the attorney offered little comfort, only the promise of a longer conversation the following morning. The moment he ended the call, Everett's first instinct was to reach for his phone again, this time dialing Celeste, desperate for reassurance that at least one part of his plan remained secure. She did not answer. He tried twice more before a message finally appeared on his screen, cold and short, nothing like the warmth she had shown him only days earlier. "You told me everything was handled," the message read, and Everett felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with the marriage unraveling around him. He drove to her apartment that same night, ignoring the late hour, ignoring the fact that Zariah remained behind in a house that no longer felt like his. Celeste opened the door with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable in a way that unsettled him more than outright anger would have. "You told me she wouldn't get anything," Celeste said the moment he stepped inside, her voice sharp enough to cut through the tension immediately. "She can't," Everett insisted, though even as he said it, doubt had already begun creeping into his voice. "Then why are you shaking?" Celeste asked, watching him with the same calculations Zariah had once used to study spreadsheets. It was in that moment that Everett understood, with sickening clarity, that the woman he had betrayed his marriage for was not standing beside him out of love, but out of the promises he had made her, promises now threatening to collapse, along with everything else. Standing in her doorway, Everett realized how little he actually understood the woman he had risked everything for, a woman whose affection had always arrived, wrapped around expectations he had never fully examined. He had told himself, for months, that what he felt for Celeste was different, more honest, more alive than anything left in his marriage, and he had used that belief to justify every lie he told Zariah along the way. Now, watching Celeste calculate the situation with the same coldness he once found thrilling in her, he began to wonder whether what he felt for her had ever been love at all, or simply the intoxicating relief of being desired without complication. What Everett did not yet know was that Celeste had been keeping records of her own message threads where he described in detail the wealth he intended to hand her once the divorce was finalized. She had never trusted him fully, not in the way a woman trusts a man she believes will stay, but rather in the way someone protects themselves against a partner they suspect may eventually disappear. As his composure cracked in front of her, Celeste began quietly preparing to protect herself, unwilling to be left holding nothing once his empire finished crumbling. Everett realized, standing in the doorway of an apartment that suddenly felt colder than his own home, that he was now caught between two women, one he had wronged, but who had prepared for exactly this outcome, and one he had trusted, but who was already calculating her own exit. Meanwhile, Zariah did nothing at all. She did not call him, did not send a single message, did not attempt to capitalize on his unraveling in any dramatic or public way. She simply waited, the same way she had waited through 6 months of quiet investigation, understanding that patience, more than anger, was the sharpest tool she possessed. Late that night, her phone rang, and Marlowe's voice came through, calm but unmistakably charged with new information. "He just made another mistake," Marlowe said, and Zariah closed her eyes, allowing herself a small, quiet breath before asking what had happened. Marlowe explained that while reviewing the flagged transactions, she had uncovered evidence that Everett had misrepresented certain figures in an official financial disclosure, a mistake serious enough to draw scrutiny from more than just his own legal team. If this reached the wrong hands, Marlowe explained, Everett stood to lose control over a significant portion of the very assets he had been so desperate to protect. Zariah listened, without interrupting, absorbing the information the way she absorbed everything, methodically, without letting emotion cloud her judgment. Still, she remained resistant to turning the entire situation into a public battle, unwilling to reduce 10 years of her life into a spectacle for others to consume. Instead, she decided to offer Everett one final opportunity, a narrow path that would allow him some dignity if he chose to take it. She proposed 3 conditions through Marlowe's office: an honest acknowledgement of the affair, full transparency regarding every asset connected to their marriage, and a fair, uncontested divorce settlement negotiated without further deception. Everett refused, clinging instead to the belief that Zariah's feelings for him would eventually soften her resolve. "You love me," he told her, when they spoke again, his voice carrying the same arrogance that had defined their marriage for years. "I know you do." Zariah said nothing for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable for him. "I love the man you used to be," she finally said. "I don't love the man standing in front of me now." The words landed with more force than any accusation could have, and for the first time, Everett seemed to understand that this was not a negotiation he could charm his way out of. He asked her, almost desperately, what it was that she actually wanted from him. "I want the truth," she answered simply, and in that single sentence, an entire decade of carefully maintained illusions began to collapse around him. Zariah revealed to him, in that same conversation, that when she left the house the following day, she would not simply be walking away with her belongings. She intended to reclaim a formal stake in the very company he had spent years insisting belonged to him alone, using the original agreement he had signed and long since forgotten. Everett had spent months preparing for a fight he thought he understood, one where he controlled the money and she controlled nothing but her emotions. He had not prepared for a version of Zariah who understood the architecture of his empire as intimately as its foundation, because she had helped pour the very concrete it stood on. The next morning arrived quieter than Everett expected, the house holding a stillness that felt unfamiliar even in rooms he had lived in for a decade. He assumed, waking alone in their bedroom, that Zariah had already left some time before dawn, gone the way he had demanded only hours earlier. When he walked downstairs, he found the living room and hallway exactly as they had always been, but the office at the end of the hall stood completely empty. There was no shouting, no scattered belongings left behind in anger, no dramatic scene for him to walk into. Every trace of Zariah's presence had been removed with the same precision she brought to everything else in her life, calm, deliberate, complete. There was no argument left to have, no plea left to make, because she had already said everything that needed saying the night before. On the kitchen counter sat her wedding ring, placed gently beside a single folded letter, the paper catching the early morning light through the window. Everett picked up the letter with hands that trembled slightly, unsure whether he wanted to know what it said. In it, Zariah explained that she was not leaving because he had ordered her to go. She was leaving because she had finally accepted a truth that had taken her months to fully absorb. A marriage cannot survive when only one person still honors the vows that built it. She wrote that she did not hate him, that hatred required more energy than she was willing to spend on someone who had already made his choice long before she made hers. Everett read the letter twice, then set it down slowly, the silence of the empty house pressing in around him. Before he could fully process what had happened, his phone buzzed with a formal legal notification, the kind of message that arrives with cold procedural language, regardless of the personal devastation behind it. Certain assets he believed were entirely his own were now under review, subject to claims tied to the original agreement he had dismissed as outdated years earlier. Transfers he thought had been buried deep within corporate paperwork were now flagged, drawing scrutiny from compliance officers who answered to no personal loyalty. Word began to spread quietly among colleagues and investors, the kind of whispered speculation that damages reputations long before any formal conclusion is reached. Celeste, watching the unraveling from a careful distance, made her decision within days. She had built her fantasy around a version of Everett that promised wealth, stability, and a future free of consequence, not a man suddenly weighed down by scandal and scrutiny. When she finally stopped answering his calls altogether, Everett understood, with a clarity that arrived far too late, that she had never loved the man beneath the money. She had loved what the money made him appear to be. Alone in the house that had once felt like a symbol of everything he built, Everett found himself standing at the same dining table where the entire unraveling had begun. He remembered the exact tone of Zariah's voice when she told him to read the envelope before he made her leave, remembering how certain he had been that it contained nothing more than paperwork he could easily dismiss. At the time, he believed she was bluffing, attempting to frighten him with the kind of empty threat a desperate wife might make on her way out the door. Now, standing in the wreckage of everything he had assumed was permanent, he finally understood that it had never been a threat at all. It had been a warning, offered honestly, that he had chosen not to hear. Zariah, meanwhile, began building a life defined by something she had not experienced in years: quiet. She did not seek to become the wealthiest person to emerge from the marriage, nor did she feel any need to humiliate Everett publicly for the sake of satisfaction. Her focus shifted instead toward her own work, her own name, and the slow process of remembering who she had been before she spent a decade shrinking herself to fit inside someone else's story. Marlowe, who had grown genuinely fond of her client over the months they worked together, asked her one afternoon whether she had any regrets about how everything had unfolded. "Yes," Zariah admitted, without hesitation. "For loving him?" Marlowe asked gently. "No," Zariah said, shaking her head slightly. "For forgetting myself for so long while I was busy loving him." There was no dramatic collapse that followed the admission, no flood of tears finally released after months of restraint. Instead, something quieter settled over her, a slow unclenching in her chest that she had not realized she was carrying until it finally began to ease. She thought of the countless dinners where she had swallowed her own exhaustion to ask about his day instead, the vacations planned entirely around his preferences, the small, cumulative erosion of a woman who had once known exactly who she was before she folded herself around someone else's ambitions. This admission opened something in her that felt closer to healing than anger ever had. She began to recall, in quiet, unguarded moments, all the time she had stayed silent to preserve a peace that only ever benefited him. She remembered years of watching Everett take credit for ideas she had built from nothing, years of swallowing her own opinions so the room could remain comfortable for everyone but herself. The truth settled over her slowly. The real fight had never been about reclaiming money or assets. It had been about reclaiming the parts of herself she had quietly surrendered, one compromise at a time, until she barely recognized the woman she had become. Weeks later, Everett appeared at her office unannounced, a version of himself she barely recognized, stripped of the confidence that once defined every room he entered. He apologized, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it, his shoulders carrying the weight of consequences he had never expected to face. "I thought you would never actually leave," he admitted, and for a moment, Zariah felt something close to pity for the man standing in front of her. "That," she told him, "was the greatest mistake you ever made." "Is there any chance for us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, hope flickering weakly behind the exhaustion in his eyes. Zariah studied him for a long moment before answering, allowing the silence to carry its own weight. "No," she said finally, without anger, without cruelty, simply stating a fact she had already settled within herself. There was no venom in her voice, no desire to wound him further than circumstances already had. It was simply a decision, made with the same clarity she brought to every important choice in her life. Confused, Everett asked why. If she felt nothing left for him, she had still allowed him to retain a portion of ownership in the company during the settlement. Zariah smiled faintly, the first genuine smile he had seen from her in months, though it carried no warmth meant for him. "Because I refused to become you," she said simply, and in that single sentence, Everett understood the full weight of everything he had lost. In the months that followed, the divorce settlement was finalized with far less public drama than either Everett or Celeste had anticipated. Zariah retained what was legally and rightfully hers, refusing to pursue anything beyond fairness, unwilling to let bitterness dictate the terms of her new beginning. She did not attempt to seize control of the entire company, nor did she try to erase Everett from an industry he had spent years building, even imperfectly. Her goal had never been destruction for its own sake. It had been recognition, acknowledgement, and the restoration of a truth Everett had spent years trying to bury. Everett, by contrast, lost far more than assets in the months that followed their final conversation. He lost the unquestioning trust of colleagues who once respected him, many of whom now viewed him through the lens of scandal rather than success. He lost Celeste, who moved on quickly once it became clear that the version of Everett she wanted no longer existed outside of his own imagination. He lost a portion of the wealth he had once flaunted so effortlessly, a portion now legally recognized as belonging to the woman he had once dismissed, as contributing nothing. But the deepest loss, the one that lingered long after the paperwork was signed and the assets divided, was the slow, painful realization of who Zariah had actually been all along. He had spent years believing he could discard her easily, certain that her devotion made her weak, certain that her quiet nature meant she lacked the strength to fight back. Instead, he discovered, far too late, that the woman he thought he could dismiss without consequence was the very foundation upon which his entire success had been built. Everett's mother, Odessa Whitmore, who had once viewed Zariah with quiet condescension, found herself reassessing everything she thought she knew about her daughter-in-law during the months the truth slowly emerged. She had always assumed her son's success was entirely his own doing, shaped by ambition, inherited from his father, untouched by outside help. Watching the divorce unfold, watching the details surface one by one, Odessa began to understand how much of her son's rise had depended on a woman he had spent years quietly erasing from the story. It was a humbling realization for a woman who had never once thanked Zariah for anything, and in private, she found herself wishing she had seen the truth years earlier. Months after the divorce was finalized, a single envelope arrived at Zariah's new apartment, addressed in Everett's familiar handwriting. She recognized it immediately, setting her coffee down carefully before opening it at the small table near her window, overlooking the quiet street below. Inside was a letter, shorter than the ones exchanged during the divorce proceedings, written in a tone stripped of the arrogance that had defined so much of their marriage. Everett wrote that he finally understood what he had thrown away, that success without someone to share it with meant far less than he had once believed. He wrote that he thought of her often, not with resentment, but with a quiet, aching regret that had settled permanently into the corners of his life. Zariah read the letter slowly, twice, allowing herself to feel whatever emotion rose naturally, rather than forcing herself toward either forgiveness or anger. When she finished, she did not reach for her phone to respond, did not feel the familiar pull to explain herself or offer him closure he had not earned. She folded the letter carefully and placed it inside a drawer in her desk, not as something to revisit, but as a quiet acknowledgement that the chapter truly had ended. Then, she stepped outside onto her small balcony, the city stretching wide and bright beneath a sky just beginning to shift toward evening. Marlowe called her later that same day, her voice carrying the familiar warmth that had grown between them over the months of their working relationship. "Are you doing all right?" Marlowe asked, and Zariah found herself smiling before she even answered. "For the first time in 10 years, she said, I don't have to ask myself what I need to do to make someone else happy." There was a pause on the line, comfortable rather than awkward, the kind shared between two people who understood exactly what those words had cost to earn. Zariah looked down at her hand, bare now of the ring that had once symbolized a promise Everett failed to keep. She retrieved a small wooden box from the drawer beside her bed and placed the ring inside it gently, not as a treasured keepsake to be admired later, but as a symbol of something finally, completely closed. It was not sentimentality that guided her hand in that moment. It was the quiet, deliberate act of placing a period at the end of a sentence that had gone on for far too long. In the years that followed, Zariah rebuilt her life on terms entirely her own, no longer measuring her worth by the comfort or approval of someone else. She returned to work she found genuinely meaningful, eventually establishing her own advisory firm, one built on the very expertise Everett had once claimed as solely his. Colleagues who worked with her often remarked on her composure under pressure, her precision, her refusal to let emotion cloud sound judgment, qualities she had spent a decade sharpening long before anyone recognized their true value. She never spoke publicly about the marriage, never used her past to build sympathy or draw attention, allowing her work to speak in a way words never could have. Everett, for his part, remained in the industry, though diminished, his name no longer carrying the same weight it once held among investors and colleagues. He rebuilt slowly, carefully, aware now of a lesson he had learned far too late to save what once meant the most to him. Occasionally, their paths crossed at industry gatherings, brief, polite exchanges, devoid of the anger or longing that once defined their final months together. There was no more fighting left between them, no lingering desire for reconciliation on either side, only the quiet, mutual understanding of two people who had permanently become strangers. The anniversary dinner that once marked the collapse of their marriage eventually became, for Zariah, simply another date on the calendar, no longer weighted with pain or significance. She did not mark it with sadness, nor did she allow herself the indulgence of imagining what might have been under different circumstances. Instead, she used it, each year, as a quiet reminder of the night she chose herself over the comfort of staying somewhere she was no longer respected. It became not a wound to revisit, but a marker of the exact moment her life had genuinely begun again. Looking back, it became clear to everyone who eventually learned the full story that Everett had believed, in that candlelit dining room, he was the one delivering the final blow. He thought commanding his wife to leave the following morning was an act of power, a demonstration of control over a woman he assumed would crumble without him. He never imagined that the envelope she placed in front of him that night was not a plea for mercy, but a carefully assembled reckoning, 10 years in the making. He thought he was closing a door on a woman who had given him everything. In truth, he was closing the door on the only person who had ever loved him honestly, without condition, without hidden motive, without the calculations that defined every other relationship he built afterward. The envelope Zariah handed him that evening was never meant as an act of revenge, though it certainly carried consequences he never anticipated. It was, in the end, simply an invoice, itemized and precise, for 10 years of quiet devotion, met with betrayal, presented to a man who never once believed he would be asked to pay it.